Hello everyone, I wanted to come back and do a short video talking to you about some of the options that you have for a stretchy bind off. So whether you're working the cowl project or the sweater project for the second Knitter's Journey Club kits, you'll need to have some way to bind off the ribbing that is either at the bottom edge of your cowl or is the hem edge of the body or the sleeves of the Spectre sweater. Now, anytime that you have ribbing, you want to obviously retain the stretchy aspect of it. That's one of its purposes, is to be able to stretch. If you are somebody who tends to be a tighter knitter and usually has to go up a needle size or so to get gauge, you may have had some trouble getting a stretchy enough bind off when the instructions just tell you to bind off loosely. So I wanted to talk to you today about a few of your options. So it doesn't matter what type of ribbing, I just happen to have a knit one, purl one ribbing on my needles for this example, but this will work for any ribbing that you might need to bind off. The first option I'm going to show you is a little bit stretchier, so consider this sort of option A in terms of stretchy. And sometimes this will be written in your pattern instructions as simply bind off in pattern. So what this instruction is telling you to do is, if you have knit one, purl one, or knit two, purl two, is to work each of those stitches as they appear already set up on your needles. So for instance, I would start here with a knit one, and then I would work the second stitch, which is a purl stitch, as that purl. I'm going to move my yarn to the back just to get it out of the way, and I'm going to bind off one stitch. So my next stitch is a knit stitch, so I would knit into that, and then I would bind that stitch off. So I would continue across the setup of stitches working that way. A lot of times, because you're moving the yarn from the front to the back to work the ribbing, you will gain a bit of stretch. Again, if you're a super tight knitter, that may not be quite enough. So let me show you your second option. Option number 2 would be to bind off and knit, but we're going to add an extra step, which will make this sort of the middle range stretchy ribbing technique for bind offs. So I've worked 2 stitches where I've bound those stitches off, and I have 1 stitch remaining on my right hand needle. I'm just going to slide that back to my left hand needle, and regardless of whether this was a knit or purl stitch, I'm going to knit into that stitch. So I've basically added an extra stitch length, if you will, that's going to be across the horizontal line of these stitches. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work the next stitch on my needles as it is in pattern. So in this case, a purl stitch. And then I'm going to take that first stitch and bind it off over the second stitch. I'm now going to go ahead and slip this stitch back to my left hand needle. I will knit into it again. And now I'll bind off the next stitch that comes up in order, which is a knit stitch. So I'll just knit that, and then I'll pull the first stitch over it. And you can see that that gives you a fairly non-bumpy edge. You will have little tiny holes here at the base of those stitches that you cast on or knit that extra knit stitch, but it will also greatly increase the stitch stretchiness throughout there, because you're basically adding an extra stitch to every other stitch. This is a great bind off if you are working something that has some lace patterning to it, because it sort of gives you an extra little lacy edge. The final one that I'm going to show you is actually a sewn bind off. Let me back up all of these stitches and pop them back on my needles. The sewn bind off, there are several of these out there. You certainly can Google them. If you're somebody who's working the cowl project, Justina gives you what she's got written as the tubular bind off, but I don't think that's what it's called here in the States. I think that that's a different technique. The tubular bind off, as I know it here in the States, is a knit bind off, and that's a sewn bind off. So she does discuss the process for that in the information on the cowl, but I wanted to provide a great sewn bind off option that's maybe a little bit easier to work, and again is something that my sweater club folks can work as well. So you'll need a couple of things, a darning needle or tapestry needle. I like to use the one that has a slightly bent up tip. I just think it's easier to get it into the stitches, and that little hook in it kind of helps keep the stitches on the needle. You can use any darning needle, whether it's straight or one of the ones that has a hook. The chibi needles are very popular. I've had some questions about whether you need to have multiple different sizes of these needles to use a larger one for larger gauge knits and a smaller one for smaller gauge knits. To be honest, I use this size needle for basically all of my darning in, weaving in end needs. Everything from fingering up through worsted. As long as the yarn will fit through the eye of the needle, you can use it. The only caveat to that would be possibly lace weight yarn that's very lightweight. You might not want something quite this size pushing through the live stitches. So to work this particular sewn bind off that I'm going to show you, you would cut your length of working yarn approximately 3 times. I have a little extra here. The length of your knit stitches on the needles. So you will cut your working yarn, and using your darning needle, you'll go ahead and thread that into the needle's eye. And this will be worked with the right side of your knitting facing you. So if you're working in the round, that's not a huge deal because it's probably already facing you. But you're going to be working right to left with the right side of your work facing you. Okay, so the first step to work this is I'm going to insert my tapestry needle's tip into the first 2 stitches purlwise. So I'm going to work from front to back. Back to front, so purlwise, putting both of them on the tapestry needle at the same time. And I'm going to pull the yarn through, and I'm going to leave these 2 stitches sitting right there on my knitting needle. The next step is to take the tapestry needle and insert it into the first stitch as if to knit. So front to back. You're going to pull your yarn through, and as you do that, you can push that stitch off the needle. So that is now going to be the first bound off stitch here. So from here, this is very simple and repetitive. You're going to go ahead and repeat inserting the tapestry needle purlwise into the 2 stitches on your knitting needle. You're going to pull through, and then you're going to insert your tapestry needle into the first stitch knitwise, pull the yarn through, and slide that off the needle. And you don't want to pull this super, super tight. You want to leave some looseness in these loops, because after all, that's what you're trying to achieve, right? Is the stretchiness of binding off this upper edge that way. So again, I'm going to repeat that step, those 2 steps. So I'm going to go in as if to purl into both of the stitches, first 2 stitches on my needle. Then I'm going to knit into the first stitch and slide that off the needle. So you would continue this along, working these 2 steps, the going through purlwise, the going through knitwise, and sliding off your needle until you had worked all of the live stitches. So this will bind off for you, and at the same time you can see this gives it a nice level of stretch. It's about the same level of stretch as my cast on. Trying to pull that evenly for you. So this particular method will give you kind of the 3rd level of stretchiness, and it gives you a bound off edge that is very similar to your cast on edge, assuming you use some form of a long tail cast on, whether it's a traditional long tail cast on or something like the old Norwegian cast on that we used for my cowl club members. So you'll work this the whole way along, and once you get to the last stitch, so there would just be one stitch remaining on the needle here, you go back in through it knitwise, pull that through, and remove this off the needle. And then you can then weave in your ends on the back side of your piece. So I hope that you found that helpful to help you get your projects off the needles. If you're somebody who's struggled with getting a stretchy bind off, that gives you kind of 3 different options from sort of least stretchy to most stretchy. So see what works best for your particular style of knitting, and hopefully that will get you a nice stretchy bound off edge so you can actually get your project pulled on and wear it with pride. That's it for now. Take care.